What are some of the defining features of the Islamic Middle Ages? What is Kalam? Who are the Qadarites, the Murji'ites, and the Mutazilites? What is Tawheed? Who are the Ash'arites? Where do they stand in various theological debates? What is the principle of Balkafa? With the rise of the Abbasids in the year 750, we enter our second great era of Islamic history, which we're here going to call the Middle Ages, Medieval Islam, or the Classical Islamic period. While breaks in history are always artificial, no one who lived through the year 750 would have noticed late antiquity ending and the Middle Ages beginning. Adding some chapter breaks into the story of Islam can help us notice transformations and patterns. There are going to be many distinctions between late antique or early Islam and the Islam of the Middle Ages. In fact, many of the thoughts, customs, literatures, and art forms that seem to define Islam today are medieval, not late antique. We met some examples of this previously. The biographical materials on Muhammad, like the Sirah ibn Ishaq and the various collections of hadith, all appear in the Abbasid period, long after the first Ummah was formed in 622. Sure, these literatures were trying to talk about early Islam, but the literature's own existence is very medieval, because they're literature. Remember that late antique Islam was marked by the oral culture of the people that we would later call Arabs. People who memorized the Quran, or passed along oral reports of the first Muslims, because writing in Arabic was a major force in early Islamic culture. But this is exactly not the case in the Islamic Middle Ages. While early Islam was defined by its orality, medieval Islam is undoubtedly the most literate pre-modern culture in world history. It all goes back to Khorasan. Remember the region of Khorasan in Persia on the eastern frontier of the Umayyad and now Abbasid empires? The Persians had been fighting with the Chinese on behalf of the caliphs, on and off for quite a while. And in the middle of these Chinese-Persian interactions came a little cultural exchange called paper. In the Umayyad world, if you needed to write a book, say a Quran, you needed parchment, vellum made from animal skin, or papyrus. These are expensive, time-consuming to make, and heavy. But paper is quick to make. It's light and it's cheap. It's made from wood shavings and sawdust, so it's produced from literal garbage. And once you have paper, you have inexpensive books. Lots and lots of books. The Sirah and the voluminous hadith collections are just some examples of these medieval Islamic developments that sprang out of the use of paper. Paper meant that you could cheaply write a book with hundreds of pages that was light enough to carry in one hand. Arabic speakers called such bundles of paper a rizma, a pack, which is why we still, to this day in English, refer to a bundle of paper as a ream. Another major development of the Islamic Middle Ages that we've met before is the Abbasid turn to fiqh, that is, the human attempt to understand God's sharia, the way God wants the world to work and for humans to behave. This developed in the Middle Ages because the access to paper, you need lots of copies of the Quran and Hadith collections to research fiqh, but also because in the Abbasid period, it was clear that Islam was not defined by the Arabs or by any one royal house like the Umayyads. Islam was defined by something beyond ethnicity or politics. It was defined by human morality and practice. Islam was what people were supposed to do. And that leads us to the next big shift in Islamic history in the Middle Ages. If it's clear that Islam is what people are supposed to do, for instance, the practices that we call the 5 pillars of Islam, Well, what were Muslims supposed to think? Going back to the Quran, we're told to believe or have faith in certain things, especially God and God's oneness. Well, that's easy enough, but sooner or later you have to ask, well, what do these practices mean? For instance, the first pillar of Islam, the Shahada, is to verbally testify that there's no God but God. Great, but what does that mean exactly? What does it mean to claim that God is one? Now, usually, when we say something is one, what we mean is it's a single thing, like an object. One tree, one cat, one taco. But God isn't a thing. God doesn't have matter or space or an edge. So what does it mean to claim that God is one? That there is no God but God? Also, the Shahada asks you to testify that Muhammad is God's messenger. That is, he's the recipient of Wahi, a revelation called the Quran. Well, what does that mean precisely? The Quran is a collection of oral performances, a recitation of words that a person says out loud. And Muhammad was the first person to receive these words. But then we have to ask, what was the Quran before Muhammad spoke it? If the Quran is a collection of spoken words, and they came from God, does that mean that God has a mouth? A tongue? Teeth? A throat? That seems a bit strange to say, as if God was just some person like any other. But then, how can God speak to a human like Muhammad, who then in turn speaks to other humans like us, if God doesn't have speech organs like a human does? And if God doesn't have a body like a person, that is, God has no speech organs, what does it mean to say that he speaks the words called the Quran? And what is the Quran anyway, if it's not sounds made with the human organs of speech? These kinds of problems, and many more like them, arose en masse in the Islamic Middle Ages as there were more and more books, more and more reading, and of course, more and more Muslims. The question here is all about orthodoxy. What is the right opinion? Sure, we're supposed to have iman, faith, but what are we precisely supposed to have faith in? Surely it must matter, right? For instance, if the Quran is clear that you have to know that God is one and not two, then obviously what you personally think does make a difference. This discussion of what a Muslim is precisely supposed to believe is called kalam. While fiqh is a debate over what a Muslim is to do, kalam is the debate over what a Muslim is to think. Kalam is literally talk or discussion. People exchanging words over matters of Islamic orthodoxy, not asking just what is right, but what does one have to think to be a proper Muslim at all? We often translate kalam into English as Islamic theology, using the Christian word theologia for God talk. But unlike Christian theology, Islamic kalam is quite a bit less formal. There have been relatively few times in Islamic history where there's been, for example, an official state orthodoxy promoted by a government. Meanwhile, having official state orthodoxies has been a near constant in Christian history. There has been one major example of this in Islamic history, and we're going to meet it in a few moments. But mostly Islamic kalam, unlike theology, has been much more of a spiritual exercise. There are whole branches of Christianity which broke away from one another over theological debates, with each church having its own unique theological positions. But Muslims never had anything that extreme. While eventually there would be Shiite mosques and Sunni mosques, there's really no other issue of personal thought that divides up Muslims like Christians divide themselves up. Two Muslims attending the same mosque at the same time might have polar opposite positions regarding kalam, and neither would ever know how different their thoughts were from the Muslim praying right next to them. Since kalam is about thought, and thoughts are invisible unless someone writes them down, it's really hard to say when kalam began. When did the first Muslims ask questions about what they were supposed to think? Well, we can't say for sure, but where the records seem to point are over 2 debates regarding morality and human choice. The first is the notorious problem of whether or not humans have free will, or if they're destined to act a certain way by their fate. It works like this. The Quran repeatedly commands humans to behave in certain ways. Do this, don't do that. Because God is telling people to act in particular fashions, it stands to reason that humans must have the ability to freely choose between good and evil, right and wrong. And that would also explain why God can reward or punish people for what they do by putting them into the garden or into the fire. This position would be called al-Qadariyya, Qadarism, the belief in the power, Qadar, of the human to act for itself. This is the belief in human free will. Qadarites believed that humans are offered free choices, and therefore they can reap what they sow. The early Kharijites and the early Shiites must have had similar beliefs to this Qadarite way, because both of those groups favored rebellion against their rulers. If you think you have the right to overthrow or kill your ruler, you must believe that they're evil people who freely chose to be evil and therefore are held responsible for it. But not so fast. To believe in the God of the Quran is to believe that God is one, single, all-powerful, and all-knowing. And if there's only one God, who knows everything always, and has all possible power over creation, then humans can't have free will. If God knows everything that everyone would ever possibly do, and God has the power to make humans do or not do anything, then how can humans be free? If humans have free choice, then God knows that some people will do the wrong thing, and God doesn't stop them. God must know in advance what they're going to do, and God must also have the power to make them obey. And yet people do disobey. And so, it must be that God has ordained this from all eternity. Some people are just destined for hellfire by the will of God. But if this is the case, then people aren't responsible for what they're doing. If you're evil, it must be that God made you evil knowingly. And so we're stuck. If people do have free will, then God can't be all-powerful and all-knowing. If people are predestined, then how can God punish them for something they didn't choose for themselves? The other early issue of Kalam that we can trace is the matter of the sinful Muslim. It works like this. Say a person truly and honestly believes in God and in the messages of the prophets, but they are serious sinners. Are they Muslims or not? If they believe that there's no God but God, and Muhammad is God's messenger, but they don't obey the moral system that God has laid out for them, have they submitted or not? If such a person who sins is in fact a Muslim, even though they're evil, that seems to negate the value of being a Muslim in the first place. If you can truly follow God and still be evil, well then what's the point of Islam? And yet, if sinning negates one's Islam, well then is anyone a Muslim at all? Everyone sins. If misdeeds make you a non-Muslim, then we have to conclude that there are no Muslims because everyone does something wrong sooner or later. The response to this was called al-Murja'un, Murji'ism, from the word murja'a, postponement. That is, humans don't have the ability to see into each other's hearts. You really don't know what anyone else really thinks or believes. Someone could say they believe in God, but they don't. Only God knows what a person really is, really wants, and really thinks. And so, while the Ummah as a political system has the right to punish sinners whose sins may harm other people, say a murderer or a rapist, no Muslim has the ability to deny that anyone else is a Muslim. So, judgment about whether a person is ultimately good or bad has to be postponed, irja, until God clarifies the matter in the world to come. These Islamic paradoxes of human morality gradually evolved into formalized schools of thought. Around the beginning of the Abbasid period, we can start to track a more organized and sophisticated system of kalam in Iraq, the Abbasid home base. These people called themselves the ISUII010, the people of divine unity and justice. But we today call them al-Mu'tazila, the Mu'tazilites, the ones who withdraw. The legend says that Hassan al-Basri, a famous wise man, was asked by a pupil of his named Wasil ibn Atta about the status of a sinful Muslim. If a person is a serious sinner, are they a Muslim or not? Hassan, the master, said, yes, they're still Muslims. And Wasil was so unhappy with the teacher's response that he withdrew from Hassan's company to start a school of his own. Whether this story is true or not, we can't say. Regardless of how they actually developed, the Mu'tazilites would become the most famous school of Kalam in the early Abbasid period, notable for their positions on divine oneness and divine justice. The Quran insists throughout that God is one, and the Mu'tazilites tried to flesh out what that meant exactly. Their explanation of divine unity is called Tawheed, unification, making one, or more idiomatically, monotheism. Tawheed works like this. God is unique, which means there's nothing at all like God. God has no parts, because if something has parts, it isn't one. Something that has parts is a composite, not a unity. And so God can't have hands or feet or eyes or a mouth. God can't have a body because bodies have parts, and therefore bodies are not one. And if God has no parts and no body, then God is beyond time and cannot change, because to pass through time or change means that you aren't one. You've either gained parts or you've lost parts, you've gotten older, or so on. Now, this God of Tawheed, who is beyond form, time, and is utterly one, speaks to the human race in revelations, like the Quran. And therein, this one God promises people will be rewarded for their good deeds. God can't break this promise, because that would mean that God changed its mind, and God won't do that because God is one. God doesn't change. Therefore, people do have free will and are responsible for our own actions. To not punish people for being evil or not reward them for being righteous would be unjust. And God has promised to be just. And because God is one, God can't change. So to claim Tawheed, divine unity for the Mu'tazilites, means that God doesn't change, that God will always behave justly, and that God has no body and doesn't pass through time. If the Quran says that God is angered or God sits upon his throne, well, that's just metaphorical language. It's not made to be taken literally. God can't become angry because God doesn't become anything, and God can't sit down any more than he can stand up. God has no parts, he can't change, and he has no body. God is, in short, nothing at all like us or anything else that we know about. But then, how can a God without a body speak? What is the Quran if God has no mouth, no lips, no air to push through her throat? In fact, if God can't change, how can God start speaking to Muhammad on a certain date in history? If God is one, God can't stop or start doing anything. Therefore, the Quran is not eternal because God alone is eternal. And the Quran isn't God because God alone is God. So therefore, since the Quran is not God, and it can't be a part of God because God has no parts, the Mu'tazilites concluded that the Quran must be a creation like anything else in this world, functionally no different than a stone or a pineapple. And you must conclude that if the Quran is not an eternal document from God, then it isn't eternally binding in any literal way. Sure, the Quran was speaking directly to Muhammad and the people of the 7th century Hijaz in a way that they could understand. But those people were long dead, and so the Quran had to be reinterpreted for other people in other times. If, as the Mutazilites concluded, the Quran is a creation of God like any other, that must mean that the meaning of the Quran is in constant flux. Now, debating whether the Quran is a creation of God or the eternal Word of God might seem like the worst kind of navel-gazing. But whether or not the meaning and validity of the Quran changes in time has major consequences. Suppose you're a mufti writing a fatwa, or a qadi deciding a case. You can't just look and see what does the Quran say, because it might not be true anymore. Or maybe it's true in some way that you can't detect. The Quran, if it's not eternally binding in a very straightforward way, is kind of hard to read and interpret. This is also probably why the 7th Abbasid Caliph, al-Ma'mun, took up Mutazilism as his court's official position. Can you see why? If the Quran, the muftis, and the qadis were not the end-all be-all of everything that's right and wrong, it means the caliph is. The caliph has the power to declare, forbid, or allow anything at all he wants. So, the weaker the authority of the Quran and the scholars of the Quran, the stronger the caliph is. And so, Ma'mun arranged for an inquisition, a mihna. Basically, a series of tests to make sure that everyone knew the official state position that the Quran was a creation like any other. In the year 833, Ma'mun started to have local authorities questioned about Mutazilite positions, and most especially whether the Quran was a creation or not. If some local governor, scholar, qadi, or mufti thought that the Quran was eternally valid as is, that is, it's not a creation like any other creation, then that means that person was questioning the authority of the caliph, and could be imprisoned for it. And some were. The most famous of these was a hadith scholar named Ahmad ibn Hanbal, the progenitor of one of the 4 Sunni madhabs we met previously, the Hanbalis. When Ibn Hanbal was brought before the inquisitors, he declared that he had no way of knowing whether the Quran was a creation or not. Even under torture, Ibn Hanbal did not renounce his opinion. Those who supported the caliphate saw Ibn Hanbal as a fool who couldn't give a logical response to a logical question. Is the Quran a created thing, yes or no? But for those who didn't care for the caliph, or the Mutazilites, Ibn Hanbal became a folk hero who wouldn't deny his faith even under mortal peril. In fact, Ibn Hanbal's fame grew, and the later caliph, al-Mutawakkil, had him released from prison. The Mihna and the affair of Ibn Hanbal was one of the few political debates over kalam in Islamic history. But the consequences of this were massive. Most especially, many people turned against the conclusions of the Mutazilites and tried to reform their arguments. This inquisition made the Mutazilites rather unpopular. The most important group to turn against the Mutazilites were called the Ash'arites, the followers of Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari. Al-Ash'ari and the Ash'arites sought to strike a compromise between the Mutazilite positions and those of the early Sunnis, people like Ibn Hanbal. Indeed, Ash'arite kalam is the default position of the overwhelming majority of Sunni scholars to this day. And while most Muslims these days would call themselves Sunnis, they would still be very likely to agree with the Mutazilite argument for Tawheed. This is because of the Ash'arites. They struck a bargain trying to find the synthesis between Sunnism and Mutazilism. The Ash'arite argument goes like this. The Mutazilites were right in their interpretation of God's oneness. Tawheed is correct. God is unique, without a body, without parts, and beyond time and change. But the conclusions that the Mutazilites drew from Tawheed were all wrong. First, the Quran must be eternal. That is, it's not a creation in time. Because if it's God's speech, and God can't begin speaking, then God must have always been speaking. Therefore, while the Quran appeared to the human race in the time of Muhammad, it always existed with God. The Quran is always true and binding because it is eternal. However, it's not a part of God or God himself. Tawheed demands that God has no parts, even though this Quran is coming from God. Alright, so how do you get around this? The trick is to remember that the Quran is entirely true and eternally correct. But God is one, and therefore completely unlike anything that we know about or encounter in our day-to-day lives. So, for example, if the Quran is God's speech or God's words, this would normally suggest that God has speech organs. And the ISUII's answer to this is, well, yeah, kinda. God does have words and speech. He must because the Quran says so, and the Quran is true. However, the ISUII's note that the Quran doesn't say how God has words and speech. The Quran tells us that God talks, but reason tells us that God does not have a mouth like a human has a mouth. Therefore, the ISUII's concluded, we must accept that God has something called speech, but we humans don't understand what that means. We can understand because we've never encountered a reality like Tawheed, absolute oneness. So, when the Quran says that God sees, suggesting that God has eyes, or that God has hands, or a face, or sits on a throne in the heavens, these things are all true. God has eyes, but they're not what we think of as eyes. And God has hands, but they're not what we understand as hands. Al-Ash'ari and his followers would famously create a principle around this called balkafa, literally from the Arabic for bila kayf, without the how. Knowing something is true and correct, but not being able to understand how it's correct. We aren't gods. We have no direct experience of what God is like, what Tawheed, divine unity, is like. Therefore, our reason is simply unequipped to discuss God. However, since God reveals itself in the Quran, we do know that God approves of this language for itself. So, if God says, I have hands, we have to know that that's true because God doesn't lie. And yet, because our only experience of hands is the experience of human hands, we can only affirm that God has hands, bila kayf, without knowing or understanding how. Likewise, God speaks, and his speech is called Quran. But we can only hear this speech through the human vessel called Muhammad. What the Quran actually is beyond the organs of human speech, or the human ear, or the human mind, is beyond us. And so we must accept that God has always been speaking the Quran, but bila kayf, without knowing how that works. And similarly, God says in the Quran that God has all power and all knowledge. God must know what humans are always going to do, right and wrong, from all eternity. So there can't be free will, because that suggests that God doesn't know what we're going to do, or that God is powerless to control it. But the ISUII's respond to this with bila kayf, without the how. God is all-knowing and all-powerful, but we're humans, and we don't have the faintest idea what all-knowing and all-powerful means. So we can trust our reason, and we can also trust the Quran, but it doesn't matter that we don't reconcile the two. We can know that we seem to be free, and believe that God controls all things, but not know how those two thoughts have to fit together. Next time, we're going to meet some Muslims who tried to solve these kinds of issues. We're going to encounter Muslims who thought that the God of the Quran and human reason could be synthesized, the first Islamic philosophers. What are some of the defining features of the Islamic Middle Ages? What is Kalam? Who are the Qadarites, the Murji'ites, and the Mutazilites? What is Tawheed? Who are the Asharites? Where do they stand in various theological debates? What is the principle of Balkafa?